November 1878. The Wind River Range, Wyoming Territory. A homesteader named Jacob Tennant was building something nobody had seen before and nobody understood. From a distance, it looked like he'd lost his mind. His perfectly good log cabin, the one he'd spent the previous spring raising, was disappearing inside a larger structure. Rough-sawn planks going up like a second skin. A peaked roof rising above his original roofline. "Looks like he's building a barn around his house," one passing freighter said. "Looks like he quit halfway and started over," said another. But Jacob wasn't quitting, and he wasn't confused. He was solving a problem that had nearly killed his family the winter before, a problem every homesteader in that valley knew too well. Wet firewood and a cabin that bled heat faster than you could feed the fire. What Jacob understood, and what his neighbors were about to learn the hard way, was that sometimes the smartest solution looks like the stupidest mistake. If you want to see how a ridiculous idea became the most copied design in the territory, hit that subscribe button. Every week, I bring you a real frontier technique that worked when lives depended on it. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one. Now let me show you what happened when winter came. Jacob Tennant wasn't an engineer. He was a trapper who'd filed a homestead claim in '77, built a decent 16 by 20-foot cabin with his brother-in-law, and figured he'd done everything right. Chinked the logs tight with moss and clay. Raised a floor on stone piers to keep out ground cold. Built a proper stone fireplace on the north wall. Laid in 4 cords of pine and spruce, stacked under a lean-to on the east side. That first winter, he learned how wrong he'd been. The cold came early, mid-October, and stayed mean. Temperatures dropped to 10 below, then 20 below, and the wind never stopped. It came whipping down from the peaks, found every crack in those log walls, and pulled the heat right out of the cabin. But the real killer wasn't the cold. It was the wet. Snow piled up against his firewood stack. Melt during the day, freeze at night. By December, half his wood was soaked through. You'd split a log and see ice crystals in the grain. Try to light it, and the fire would sputter and smoke, barely giving off heat before dying back to coals. His wife and kept a pot of snow melting on the hearth just to get drinking water. Their daughter, not yet 2, slept between them under every blanket they owned. Some mornings, the water bucket inside the cabin had a skim of ice. Jacob burned through those 4 cords by February. Had to buy more from a mill 14 miles south, greenwood, barely seasoned, that smoked worse than what he'd started with. He did the math in March, after the thaw. At that rate, he'd need 7 or 8 cords to make it through a full winter, and half of it would be wasted trying to dry itself out in the firebox. There had to be a better way. Jacob spent weeks thinking about it. He'd seen how the trappers up in the Absarica Range built cache platforms high off the ground to keep supplies dry. He noticed how the trading post and lander kept their goods in a double-walled storehouse, not for warmth, but to keep moisture out. And he remembered something his father had told him back in Pennsylvania. Heat doesn't disappear. It goes somewhere. Where's his heat going? Through the walls, through the roof, straight into the wind. Every BTU he fed into that firebox was bleeding out into the Wyoming cold, and there wasn't a thing he could do about it with the cabin as it stood. He'd chinked the logs as tight as he could. He'd banked snow against the foundation. But physics didn't care. Heat moved from warm to cold, and the wind made sure it moved fast. The idea came to him while he was restacking wood in April. He looked at his cabin, then at the lean-to, and thought, what if the wood wasn't outside the heat? What if it was inside a layer of protection? Not inside the cabin. That'd be a fire hazard and take up living space. But what if he built a second structure around the cabin itself? A simple pole-frame shed, open at the gables for airflow, with the firewood stored in the gap between the cabin wall and the outer wall. The shed would keep snow and rain off the wood. But more than that, and this is where Jacob's trapper instincts kicked in, the heat escaping through the cabin's log walls wouldn't just vanish into the wind. It would warm the air inside the shed, dry the firewood, create a buffer zone that'd slow down heat loss. He sketched it out on a piece of bark. Cabin in the center. Pole frame 8 feet out on all sides. Firewood stacked in that 8-foot gap, under a roof, with the residual warmth from the cabin slowly baking the moisture out. when he explained it to, and she looked at him for a long moment. You want to build a barn over our house. Not a barn, a shell, for the wood. Jacob, we just built this cabin. I know, and it nearly froze us. This'll work. She didn't argue, but she didn't look convinced either. By mid-May, he'd started felling lodgepole pine for the frame. He worked alone most days. His brother-in-law had moved south to take a railroad job, and the nearest neighbor willing to help was Charlie Pryor, who had his own homestead to manage. So Jacob cut, hauled, stripped bark, and sunk posts by himself. It took him 6 weeks just to get the framework standing. People asked questions when they passed by. Freighters, surveyors, a couple of Shoshone hunters who traded pelts in the area. Most of them just nodded and moved on, but you could see it in their faces, confusion. Why double your work? Why not just build a better cabin in the first place? Jacob didn't have good answers yet. He just had a hunch that refused to let go. Jacob raised the outer structure through June and July. 12 poles sunk 3 feet into the ground, squared off in a 32 by 36-foot perimeter around the cabin. Horizontal runners connecting them. Rough sawn planks for the walls. Not tight, just enough to shed wind and precipitation. A gable roof, steep enough to dump snow, with open vents at both peaks to let moisture out. Inside, between the cabin and the outer walls, he left an 8-foot corridor on 3 sides, north, east, and west. That's where the firewood would go, stacked loose on pallets, with air moving through. On the south side, where the door was, he kept the gap narrow, just 4 feet, and built a covered entry porch. The whole thing looked strange. The cabin sat inside this larger, barn-like shell, and unless you walked up close and peered through the gaps in the outer walls, you couldn't even see the original structure. People noticed. A freight hauler named Callum Driscoll stopped by in late July, took one look and said, "Tenant, what in God's name are you building?" "Firewood shelter," Jacob said. Driscoll walked a slow circle around it, shaking his head. "You build a whole second building just to keep you dry. More or less. You know they make tarps, right?" Jacob didn't answer. He was fitting a ridge beam. Driscoll wasn't the only one. By August, the story had spread. The homesteader who built a barn over his cabin. The man who didn't trust his own construction. The trapper who thought he was smarter than everyone else. A contract sawyer named Raymond Poole came by to deliver planks and got an eyeful. Poole had been building in the territory for a decade. He stood there, hands on his hips, and said it plain. "You're wasting lumber, tenant. That cabin's fine. You just need to split your wood earlier and keep it covered. This," he gestured at the whole structure. "This is what a man does when he doesn't understand the basics." Jacob kept working. And another thing, Poole continued. "You're trapping moisture between those walls. Come winter, you'll have rot. You'll have mold. You're making it worse, not better." And, who was sitting on the porch mending a shirt, looked up. "He's thought it through, Mr. Poole." Poole tipped his hat. "With respect, ma'am, thinking and knowing are 2 different things." That night, Jacob and didn't talk much, but he could feel the doubt settling into the cabin like cold air under the door. What if Poole was right? What if he'd just spent a summer building something useless? Or worse, something that had ruined the cabin from the inside out? He'd know soon enough. Winter was coming. The social cost was real. At the general store in South Pass City, men would go quiet when Jacob walked in. Not hostile, just uncomfortable, the way people get around someone who might be losing his grip. One evening in late August, a rancher named Boone McCready clapped Jacob on the shoulder and said, "Listen, tenant, if you need work this fall, I could use a hand with the cattle drive. Steady pay." It was a kind offer. It was also an escape hatch. A way for Jacob to admit the shed was a mistake, take a job, and let everyone forget about it. Jacob thanked him and said no, because he wasn't doubting anymore. Every time he walked into that corridor between the cabin and the outer walls, he felt the difference. The air was still, protected. Even in late summer, with no fire burning, the space felt insulated. He'd hung a scrap of wet canvas in there one afternoon just to see what would happen. 3 days later, it was dry and stiff as canvas should be. Meanwhile, a similar scrap he'd left outside on a rock was still damp and starting to mildew. The system was working. He just needed winter to prove it. The first snow came October 9th light. just a dusting on the peaks. By the 15th, it was serious. 6 inches overnight. Temperature dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Jacob lit the fire in the cabin, same as always. Loaded the firebox with split pine from the corridor on the north side. Wood that had been sitting there since August, under the roof, out of the weather. It lit fast, burned clean, almost no smoke. He looked at Anne. She looked back. Dry, she said. Dry, he confirmed. Outside, his neighbors were already struggling. The Pryor family, half a mile south, had stacked their winter wood under a canvas lean-to. The canvas had ripped in the wind, and now their entire supply was covered in snow. Charlie Pryor was out there with a hatchet, trying to split frozen rounds just to get something that had burned. The Dunlap brothers, a mile west, had tarped their wood, but the tarp sagged and pooled water. Every piece they pulled was damp, their cabin filled with smoke every time they fed the fire. Jacob's wood? Bone dry, and getting drier. He'd stacked it loose, with gaps for air to move. The heat leaking through the cabin's log walls, heat that used to vanish into the wind, was now drifting into the corridor, warming the space between the cabin and the outer shell. Not hot, just warm enough to pull moisture out of the wood, day after day. By November, every piece he pulled from the stack felt lighter, seasoned, ready. And the cold kept coming. December 11th, 1878. The worst storm anyone in the valley had seen. Temperature plunged to 28 below. Wind hit 40 miles an hour. Snow came sideways, piling 6-foot drifts against anything that stood still. The Pryor family ran out of dry wood by the second day. They burned green aspen and got more smoke than heat. Cabin temperature dropped to 35 degrees Fahrenheit inside. Charlie wrapped his kids in every coat they had and moved them all into one bed. The Dunlaps were worse off. Their chimney started drafting backwards in the wind. Smoke filled the cabin. They had to open a window to breathe, which let the cold pour in. By the third day, they'd moved into their neighbor's dugout just to survive. Jacob's cabin? 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Steady, all through the storm. He fed the fire once in the morning, once at night. The outer shell blocked the wind. The air gap insulated the cabin walls. The dry wood burned slow and hot, radiating warmth into the stone hearth, which held the heat for hours. On the fourth morning, the wind died. The sky cleared. Jacob stepped outside. The outer shed was buried on the north side, drifted halfway up the walls. But inside, in the corridor, the firewood was dry. Untouched. Ready. He split around just to check. The grain was tight, pale, brittle. He knocked 2 pieces together and heard that clean, sharp crack of seasoned wood. Charlie Pryor rode over that afternoon, knocked on the outer wall. Jacob opened the entry porch door. Charlie stood there, snow to his knees, and said, "How?" Jacob stepped aside, let him see the corridor, the stacked wood, the cabin walls radiating faint warmth into the space. Charlie walked the perimeter slowly, touched the wood, looked up at the vented gable. Look back at Jacob. You're warmer than we are, and you've barely burned anything. Wood's dry, Jacob said. Stays dry. Burns clean. How much warmer? 55 inside. Maybe a bit higher near the fire. Charlie shook his head. We're at 35 on a good day. He stood there for another minute, just looking. Then he said, Poole called you a fool. I know. Poole's the fool. Charlie wasn't exaggerating about the difference. That 4-day storm had been a crucible. The Dunlap brothers had burned through an entire half-cord trying to keep their cabin above freezing and failed. They'd spent 2 nights in a neighbor's dugout, which was warmer than their own cabin simply because it was underground and surrounded by earth. Dirt doesn't hold heat like stone, but it doesn't bleed it away like a wind-blasted log wall either. The Pryors had fared slightly better, but only because Charlie had kept a fire going around the clock. He'd barely slept, just fed logs into the firebox every 2 hours, day and night, and still watched the temperature inside drop every time the wind picked up. His wife had wrapped their youngest in a buffalo robe and kept her in bed the entire time. The child survived, but it was close. Too close. Jacob, meanwhile, had slept through the night. Both nights. He'd stoked the fire before bed, let it burn down to coals, and woke to a cabin that was still 52 degrees Fahrenheit. The stone hearth held the heat. The outer shell blocked the wind. The air gap insulated the walls. And the drywood, God, the drywood, burned so clean and hot that he got 4 hours of solid warmth from a single load. And had baked bread during the storm. Not because they needed it, but because the cabin was warm enough and they had time. That's what got people's attention more than anything. The tenants weren't just surviving. They were comfortable. Word spread fast. By late December, half the homesteaders in the valley had come by to see Jacob's setup. Some were skeptical. Some were desperate. All of them were cold. Jacob walked them through it, showed them the corridor, explained the principle. Heat doesn't just warm the air inside the cabin. It moves through the walls. In a normal cabin, that heat escapes into the wind and you never see it again. But if you capture it, even a little, you can put it to work. The outer shell wasn't airtight. Didn't need to be. It just had to block the wind and keep precipitation off the wood. The gap between the cabin and the shed created a buffer zone. Cold air outside, warm air inside, and a layer of drying firewood in between. The firewood itself acted like insulation. And as it dried, it became better fuel, which meant the fire burned hotter and longer with less effort. Raymond Poole, the sawyer who'd called it a waste, came by in January. Didn't say much. Just walked the perimeter, looked at the wood, felt the warmth coming off the cabin walls. Finally, he said, "What's your burn rate?" 3 cords so far. We're halfway through winter. 3. Poole did the math in his head. I'm at 5.5, and I'm freezing. Jacob didn't gloat, just nodded. And your wood's dry? All of it. Every piece. Poole stood there, hands in his coat pockets, breath steaming in the cold. I was wrong. Happens. No, I was wrong, and people listened to me. That's worse. He left without another word. But 2 weeks later, Jacob saw smoke rising from Poole's claim. Not from a chimney, but from a soffit. Poole was milling lumber, building his own shell. By the end of that winter, the numbers were undeniable. Jacob had burned 4 cords total. His neighbors in conventional cabins had burned between 7 and 9. Temperature inside Jacob's cabin stayed between 52 degrees Fahrenheit and 58 degrees Fahrenheit, even on the coldest nights. The Pryors, Dunlaps, and others were struggling to hold 40 degrees Fahrenheit. But the real difference was the firewood itself. Jacob's system wasn't just conserving heat, it was creating better fuel. Every piece of wood stored in that corridor spent weeks or months in a warm, dry, ventilated space. Moisture content dropped to almost nothing. The wood became harder, denser, more efficient. A dry log puts out about 8,000 BTUs per pound. A wet log? Maybe 5,000. That is 60% gain in heat output just from drying. Jacob wasn't burning less wood because he was tougher or because his cabin was smaller. He was burning less because every piece of wood he fed the fire was doing more work. And his neighbors were starting to understand. The barn over the cabin wasn't a mistake. It was a system. A simple, ugly, brilliant system that turned wasted heat into dry fuel and turned dry fuel into a winter you could survive without suffering. Stay with me, because what happens next is when the whole territory starts paying attention. The physics were simple, but the implications were huge. In a standard cabin, radiant heat escapes through the walls at a rate determined by the temperature differential and the wall's R value. A single-layer log wall, even well-chinked, has an R value of maybe 8 to 10. That means for every degree of difference between inside and outside, you're losing about 1/10 of a BTU per square foot per hour. Multiply that across 600 square feet of wall surface, and you're hemorrhaging heat. Jacob's system didn't eliminate that loss. Physics doesn't allow it, but it recaptured a portion of it. The heat moving through the cabin walls warmed the air in the corridor. That warmer air reduced the temperature differential at the wall surface, which slowed the rate of loss. Not by a lot, maybe 15% to 20%, but enough to matter over the course of a long winter. And then there was the firewood itself. Moisture content is everything. Green wood could be 50% water by weight. Even seasoned wood that's been stacked outside for a year might still be 20% to 25% moisture. But wood stored in Jacob's corridor, in that warm, dry, ventilated space, it was dropping to 10% or lower. And every percentage point of moisture you remove translates directly into more usable heat. A quart of pine at 25% moisture gives you maybe 14 million BTUs. That same quart at 10% moisture? Closer to 18 million. That's a 28% gain in energy output from the same amount of wood. Jacob wasn't just burning less. He was extracting more from every log he burned. People started doing their own math. If you could cut your wood consumption by a third and still stay warmer, that was money saved. Labor saved. Suffering avoided. The upfront cost of building the shell, a few days of work and maybe 400 board feet of lumber, paid for itself in a single season. Spring came late in 1879. Snow lingered into April, and the melt revealed a valley that had fundamentally changed its mind about Jacob Tennant. By May, 3 homesteaders were building their own versions of the shell system. Charlie Pryor was first. He'd spent the winter watching his family shiver while Jacob's family stayed warm, and he wasn't going to do that again. He started milling lumber in March, as soon as the soppit thawed enough to work. His design was simpler than Jacob's, just a 3-sided windbreak on the north, east, and west walls, open to the south for access, but the principle was the same. Firewood stored in the gap. Heat from the cabin walls drying the wood and creating a thermal buffer. The Dunlap brothers went further. They'd abandoned their original cabin after the December storm and were building fresh on higher ground. This time, they incorporated the shell from the start. Cabin first, then a pole frame structure around it with a 12-foot gap for wood storage. They even added a feature Jacob hadn't thought of. A small vent hole in the cabin's north wall, connecting the interior to the corridor, so warm air could circulate directly into the firewood storage area. Raymond Poole, the sawyer who'd called Jacob's design wasteful, didn't build a shell around his existing cabin. He tore the cabin down and started over, built a new 18 by 24-foot log structure, then raised a gable-roofed shed over the whole thing with a 10-foot perimeter gap. He used proper milled siding instead of rough planks, added hinge doors on the gable ends for ventilation control, and installed removable panels on the south side so he could adjust airflow based on wind direction. It was, in Jacob's opinion, over-engineered. But it worked, and Poole, to his credit, rode over in June and said so. "I was wrong about your setup," Poole said, "and I was loud about it. So I'm being loud about this." "You were right." Jacob nodded. "Appreciate that. I'm telling everyone who'll listen. This system works. It saves wood, it saves labor, and it saves lives. If a man's got the lumber and the time, he'd be a fool not to build one." Word traveled. By late summer, a surveyor passing through the valley counted 9 cabins with some version of a shell design. Some are full wraps like Jacob's. Some are 3-sided windbreaks. One homesteader had built a double-walled cabin from the start, with the gap filled with loose straw for insulation and a separate woodshed attached to the east wall where the prevailing wind hit hardest. The designs varied, but the logic was universal. Don't let your heat escape into nothing. Capture it. Use it. Turn waste into advantage. In September, a territorial land agent named Morris Lansdowne came through doing surveys for a railroad spur. He'd been through the valley 2 years earlier and remembered the layout. When he saw the proliferation of odd-looking double structures, he asked questions. Jacob walked him through the system, showed him the corridor, explained the thermal dynamics. Lansdowne took notes. "You mind if I write this up?" Lansdowne asked. "There's a bulletin the territory publishes for new settlers. Tips on building, farming, surviving the winter. This kind of thing could save lives." "Go ahead," Jacob said. "It's not a secret." 3 months later, Jacob received a copy of the bulletin in the mail. Page 4 had a full diagram of his cabin and shell system, with measurements, notes on materials, and a paragraph crediting the innovative adaptation developed by homesteaders in the Wind River Range. His name wasn't mentioned, probably because Lansdowne didn't remember it, but that didn't matter. The idea was out there now. Public domain. Free for anyone to copy, adapt, improve. And people did. By the winter of 1880 to 81, the shell design had spread beyond the immediate valley. A trapper passing through from the Gros Ventre Mountains said he'd seen 2 cabins with similar setups near Jackson Hole. A mail carrier reported 3 more near the South Pass. A missionary working with Shoshone families on the reservation mentioned that some of the tribe's log cabins, built with government lumber after the treaties, had been retrofitted with outer windbreaks and with storage corridors. The system wasn't universal. Plenty of homesteaders stuck with traditional designs, either because they didn't have the lumber, didn't have the time, or just didn't believe it was necessary. But among those who tried it, the success rate was absolute. Nobody who built a shell went back. And nobody who'd criticized Jacob kept criticizing. Here's what Jacob Tennant understood that most people missed. Innovation doesn't have to be complicated. The shell-over cabin system wasn't advanced engineering. It didn't require specialized tools, expensive materials, or expert knowledge. It was just a logical response to a very specific problem. Wet firewood and wasted heat, solved with materials at hand, and a willingness to look foolish until the results proved otherwise. That's the pattern you see over and over in frontier survival. The best solutions aren't the ones that look impressive. They're the ones that work when everything else fails. Think about a root cellar. It's just a hole in the ground with a roof. But it keeps potatoes from freezing in winter and spoiling in summer because the earth stays at a constant 50 degrees Fahrenheit to 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. Simple physics. Effective results. Think about a sod house. Looks like a pile of dirt. But those thick earthen walls have an R value of 20 or higher, twice what a log cabin offers, and they don't burn, rot, or blow away in a wind. Ugly but warm. Practical but permanent. Jacob's shell was the same idea. It looked like a mistake. It looked like he'd quit halfway through and built a barn instead of finishing the cabin. But solved the problem. And in the end, that's the only thing that matters. The technique continued to spread through the 1880s. By 1885, there were documented examples of shell-style cabins across Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho. The designs evolved. Some builders added interior air vents to improve circulation. Others built detached sheds close to the cabin walls to achieve the same thermal buffering effect without fully enclosing the structure. A few ingenious homesteaders in northern Montana built their cabins inside existing barns, creating a massive insulated envelope that stayed above freezing even when the outside temperature dropped to 30 below. The principle remained constant. Use the heat you're already losing. Don't let it vanish. Put it to work. Jacob himself kept refining his system. In 1882, he added a second feature, a shallow trench along the north wall, lined with flat stones, where he could place hot coals from the firebox at night. The radiant heat from those coals would warm the corridor, further drying the firewood and creating a convective loop that pulled warm air up through the vented gable and drew fresh air in from the lower gaps. It was a minor adjustment, but it improved efficiency by another 10% or so. And notice the difference. We used to go through a log every 3 hours, she said one evening in January 1883. Now it's closer to 5. Jacob nodded. He was sitting by the fire, repairing a harness. Their daughter, now 6, was asleep in the loft. The cabin was warm. The fire was steady. Outside, the wind was howling at 20 below, but inside, it felt like a normal winter evening. Poole stopped by last week and said, "Wanted to know if you'd thought about writing up your design, publishing it somewhere official. Lansdowne already did that. Poole thinks you should take credit. Put your name on it." Jacob thought about that. Doesn't matter whose name is on it. What matters is people are staying warm. And they were. By the late 1880s, the shell-over cabin design had become common enough in certain regions that it stopped being remarkable. It was just how you built if you were smart. Territorial guides recommended it. Land agents mentioned it in their promotional materials. Even the Army Corps of Engineers, when surveying routes for the Transcontinental Railroad, noted the prevalence of double-wall insulated cabins in high-altitude settlements. The mockery had turned to standard practice. The fool's errand had become accepted wisdom. Jacob Tennant lived in that cabin until 1903, when he sold the homestead and moved to Lander to be closer to his grandchildren. The new owners, a young couple from Ohio, kept the shell intact. Added a few improvements, actually. Extended the roof overhang, reinforced the pole frame, built a proper door on the north side for easier wood access. The cabin still stands today, though it's no longer occupied. It's on private land, Not open to the public, but locals know it's there. Some call it the tenant shell. Others just call it that weird barn cabin up near the ridge. Either way, it's a reminder of something important. The best ideas often look like the worst ideas until winter proves them right. So here's the question I'll leave you with. What stupid solution are you ignoring because it doesn't look right? What ugly, improvised, embarrassing fix might actually be the smartest thing you could do? Because if frontier history teaches us anything, it's this. Warmth doesn't care about appearances. Survival doesn't care about pride. And the man who's willing to look foolish in September is the one who stays warm in December. Drop a comment below and tell me, where are you watching from and what's the coldest winter you've ever faced? I read every single one and I want to hear your story. And if you got value from this, hit that subscribe button. Every week, I bring you a real technique from the frontier, the kind of knowledge that kept people alive when there was no backup plan and no second chance. See you in the next one. Educational note, this script presents historical techniques for educational and documentary purposes. Modern building codes, fire safety regulations, and construction standards have evolved significantly since the 1870s. Any historical building method discussed here should be researched thoroughly and adapted to meet current local codes and safety requirements before implementation. This content does not constitute professional engineering or construction advice.